Avery's heels struck the marble floor with a steady rhythm, each step echoing through the grand lobby. Her suitcase gilded behind her, wheels whispering across the polished stone. The chandelier above scattered light in every direction, but the warmth stopped short of the front desk, where Stephen stood with his practiced smile and rigid posture. His gaze lingered on Avery a moment too long, flicking from her face to her shoes, then to her suitcase, as if searching for a reason to question her presence. The concierge, a young man with a crisp uniform and anxious eyes, offered a brief nod before looking away, unwilling to hold her gaze. Avery paused, taking in the velvet chairs, the fresh flowers, the distant sound of cutlery from the restaurant. She adjusted her scarf, chin high, and met Stephen's eyes with a calm that unsettled him. "Good evening," she said, her voice measured and clear. Stephen's fingers tapped the desk, a subtle but impatient beat. "Reservation?" he asked, his tone clipped and formal. Avery nodded, reaching into her bag for her phone. The concierge shifted behind the desk, pretending to check something on his screen, his hands fidgeting with a stack of room keys. A couple in business attire walked by, their laughter bouncing off the marble, and Stephen's smile tightened as he watched them pass. His attention returned to Avery, his expression unreadable, the air between them thick with unspoken rules. Avery placed her phone on the counter, the reservation confirmation glowing on the screen. Stephen's hand hovered above the keyboard, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he offered a polite, "One moment," before turning to his computer, his shoulders tense and movements stiff. Avery waited, her gaze unwavering, her presence quietly challenging the boundaries that had always been drawn in this space. In the corner, a bellhop adjusted his cap, watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. The chandelier's light caught the edge of Avery's suitcase, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch all the way to the wall of the founder's portraits. Before the story continues, please let us know from where you are watching this video. Write your city or country in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit like if you believe in stories that challenge injustice. Your engagement gives power to voices that need to be heard. Stephen's fingers hovered above the keyboard, his eyes never quite meeting Avery's. He cleared his throat, the sound barely audible over the low hum of evening conversation and the distant clatter of plates from the restaurant. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight," he said, his tone smooth, almost rehearsed. Avery didn't flinch. She slid her phone across the counter, the reservation confirmation bright on the screen. "I have a reservation. Monroe, Avery." Her voice was steady, not a hint of uncertainty. Stephen's lips pressed into a thin line as he scanned the screen, searching for any excuse. The concierge, standing just behind him, glanced at Avery, then at Stephen, his brow furrowing. A couple waiting in line shifted, sensing the tension, their conversation stalling mid-sentence. Stephen tapped the keyboard, a little too hard, eyes darting to the side. "I don't see your name here," he replied, voice flat. Avery leaned in, her gaze unwavering. "It's there. I booked last week." The pause stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. The concierge's hands fidgeted with the stack of keycards, his gaze flicking between the two. Stephen inhaled, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes the system loses things. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at another hotel. Avery's jaw tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. "I'd like to speak to the manager." Stephen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You're speaking to him." The words landed with a dull thud. Behind them, the bellhop coughed, covering his mouth with a gloved hand. The lobby's quiet grew heavier, every ear tuned to the exchange. Avery straightened, reclaiming her phone with a calm, deliberate motion. "I'll wait," she said, her tone final. Stephen turned away, shoulders tense, muttering something under his breath. The concierge offered Avery a small, apologetic nod. The crystal lights overhead glinted, casting sharp reflections on the marble, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the balance to shift. Avery's gaze wandered to the far end of the lobby, where a row of portraits hung in stately silence. Her own face looked back at her from behind glass, dignified yet distant, surrounded by men in dark suits and stiff collars. The gold plaque beneath her image gleamed, but in this moment it felt like little more than decoration. Stephen, still at the desk, didn't bother to look up, his focus fixed on the screen, as if ignoring history could erase it. The air between them grew heavier, thick with all the things no one dared to say aloud. The concierge, noticing Avery's attention, hesitated with a stack of guest forms in hand. He glanced from the portraits to Avery, then quickly busied himself with paperwork, his discomfort plain. A guest walked by, casting a curious glance at the wall, then at Avery, before moving on. The bellhop paused near the elevators, his eyes, following the exchange, uncertainty flickering across his face. Avery stood tall, shoulders squared, refusing to let the moment pass without meaning. She took a slow breath, her reflection merging with those of the founders, the only black woman among a sea of pale faces. The irony stung, but she let it settle, her resolve hardening. Stephen finally glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable, but a brief flicker of uncertainty betrayed him before he turned away. The chandelier's light fractured across the glass, scattering patterns on the marble beneath her feet. Each portrait seemed to watch the scene unfold, silent witnesses to a legacy built on exclusion and quiet resistance. The room, so proud of its history, now felt like a stage for something long overdue. Avery's presence was a reminder of change, of stories that refused to stay hidden, of a legacy denied but never erased. Behind the front desk, the concierge leaned in close to the bellhop, his voice barely above a murmur. "She's the one from the portrait," he whispered, eyes darting toward Avery, then quickly away. The bellhop's grip tightened on the luggage cart, knuckles pale against the polished brass. Avery stood nearby, her posture composed, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. A guest approached the counter, but the concierge's attention faltered, his greeting mechanical. The bellhop glanced at Avery, offering a fleeting sympathetic smile before wheeling a suitcase toward the elevators. Another staff member, a housekeeper with a neat bun and tired eyes, paused as she passed, her gaze lingering on Avery for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Stephen returned, jaw set, voice clipped as he issued instructions. "Keep things moving, no delays." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, their usual rhythm disrupted. The concierge's hands fidgeted with a stack of reservation cards, his usual confidence replaced by a restless energy. Avery caught the housekeeper's eye and nodded, a silent message passing between them. The housekeeper straightened, shoulders squaring as she continued down the corridor. The bellhop, now at the elevator, pressed the button with unnecessary force, the ding echoing in the lobby's hush. Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the shuffle of feet, the averted gaze, the words left unsaid. Stephen's voice carried across the marble, but the staff's responses were muted, their loyalty shaken. The chandelier's light flickered, casting shifting patterns. Across the lobby, as if the building itself sensed the storm gathering, Avery remained still, her presence a quiet anchor in the swirling uncertainty. The staff's body language spoke volumes, shoulders tense, eyes wary, movements less certain. The old order wavered, cracks forming beneath the surface. In that heavy pause, the first hints of change began to take root, carried on whispers and sideways glances rather than open defiance. Avery turned, her lips curling into a measured smile that carried more weight than any raised voice. Stephen caught the expression, but dismissed it, straightening his tie as if clinging to a fading sense of control. The marble floor beneath them seemed to pulse with tension, reflecting the subtle shift happening in the room. The concierge, still at the desk, paused mid-sentence, his eyes darting between Avery's calm presence and Stephen's increasingly rigid stance. The bellhop lingered by the elevator, watching with a mix of caution and hope, sensing that something important was unfolding. Avery's gaze met Stephen's, unwavering, steady as stone. She didn't need to speak. The message was clear. The balance of power was changing, and she was no longer content to be overlooked. Stephen's jaw clenched, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he masked it with a forced nod. The housekeeper, arranging fresh flowers nearby, glanced up and caught Avery's eye. In that brief connection, encouragement passed between them, a silent agreement that the old ways were crumbling. A couple entered the lobby, their conversation faltering as they noticed the charged atmosphere. The chandelier overhead scattered fractured light across the marble, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to dance at Avery's feet. The staff moved more carefully now, their actions deliberate, as if aware that every gesture was being watched and weighed. Avery stepped forward, her heels clicking with quiet authority. Her smile deepened, not in triumph but in warning, a signal that the days of unchecked privilege were drawing to a close. Stephen looked away, his confidence faltering for the first time. The lobby, once a place of rigid routine, now buzzed with the promise of change. The air was thick with anticipation, every person in the room aware that something fundamental had shifted. Avery's presence, her silent challenge, left no doubt. The ground beneath privilege was no longer solid, and the storm she carried would not be ignored. Avery's hand was small, but her mother's grip was firm as they stood outside the glowing diner window. Inside, warmth and laughter spilled out, but the welcome stopped at the glass. A waitress's voice cut through the night. "We don't serve your kind here." Sharp, unapologetic. Avery's mother didn't argue. She just squeezed Avery's hand tighter, her jaw set, and knelt to fix the collar of Avery's coat, voice steady and low. "We'll find somewhere else, sweetheart." The sting of those words, the way the other diners looked away or pretended not to hear, burned into Avery's memory. She watched her mother's back as they walked away, the world suddenly colder and the streetlights harsher. Years later, Avery stands in her own hotel's lobby, fingers brushing the edge of a keycard. The memory is as crisp as the night it happened. She can still feel the ache in her chest, the lesson learned too young, that some doors are built to keep you out, no matter how hard you try to belong. She glances at her reflection in the lobby's glass, seeing both the determined woman she's become and the little girl who learned to keep her head high. The lobby is bright, filled with fresh flowers and the gentle murmur of guests, but even. Here Avery sometimes feels the chill of that old rejection. She moves through the space with quiet purpose, her mother's words echoing in her mind, a warning, a shield, and a promise all at once. As she slides the keycard into her pocket, Avery's shoulders square. The world has changed, but not enough. She walks forward, every step a silent vow that her story, and her mother's, will not be repeated. Even when the doors finally open, she never forgets what it felt like to stand outside. Stephen sat in his office years ago, sunlight slanting across the desk where his mentor's framed photo stood. The older man, a black hospitality trainer, with a patient smile and sharp eyes, had once leaned in and said, "Pride blinds better than any mask, Stephen. Don't let it." The words lingered, heavy with meaning, but Stephen was already glancing at his phone, distracted by new emails and the promise of a promotion. The advice landed, but never took root. Now, in the present, Stephen scrolled through his inbox, pausing at an old, unread message from that same mentor. The subject line was simple: "Remember why you started." He hovered over it, then deleted it without opening, a faint smirk on his lips, as if erasing the past could change the present. The camera in the office caught the moment his finger pressed delete, the gesture small but final. The photo of his mentor, now dusty and half hidden behind a stack of reports, watched over the room like a silent judge. A junior manager knocked, poking his head in. "Anything you need, Mr. Whitfield?" Stephen waved him off, barely glancing up. The younger man hesitated, then left, the door clicking shut with a quiet finality. Stephen leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He remembered the early days, shadowing his mentor through bustling lobbies, learning how to greet every guest with dignity, but somewhere along the way, ambition had edged out empathy. He looked at the photo one last time, the mentor's eyes seeming to ask a Question Stephen no longer wanted to answer. He turned the frame face down, dust motes swirling in the air. In that small private act, the rot that would one day unravel everything began to take hold. The lesson was clear, but Stephen had chosen not to see it. Marcus, the bellhop, stood in the dimly lit staff lounge, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly as he slid a folded resignation letter under the HR door, the paper creasing beneath his fingers. 28 years carrying bags, never allowed to stay, he had written, the words heavy with quiet pain. Photos of smiling guests adorned his locker, none of them sharing his skin tone, a silent testament to the invisible barriers he faced daily. The lounge was empty except for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Marcus's breath hitched as he closed his locker, the sound sharp in the stillness. The letter, now out of his hands, was destined for a pile labeled "Complaints Ignore," a place where voices like his were often lost. Down the hall, a janitor paused, hearing the faint rustle of paper. He glanced toward the lounge but said nothing, his expression a mix of sympathy and resignation. The hotel's polished floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, reflecting a world that had yet to change. Marcus walked away, his steps slow but resolute. The weight of his decision settled in, a quiet rebellion against years of being overlooked. His story, like so many others, was a thread in the fabric of systemic exclusion woven into the hotel's history. In the lobby, Avery's portrait caught, the light a silent witness to the struggles hidden behind the grandeur. The bellhop's resignation was more than a letter. It was a crack in the facade, a signal that the old order was beginning to fracture. The camera lingered on the unopened door, the letter just visible beneath it, waiting for acknowledgement that might never come. Julian, the reporter, sat hunched. Over his cluttered desk, stacks of notebooks and coffee-stained printouts crowding the space. He flipped through pages filled with scribbled dates and names, his pen circling the same pattern over and over. Third denial, this month no reservation honored. The newsroom buzzed around him, but his focus was razor-sharp, eyes narrowing, as he pieced together a story no one else seemed to want. His editor, passing by, dropped a note on his desk. Not newsworthy. The words stung, but Julian didn't stop. He tapped his pen against the margin, frustration building as he read through anonymous tips and half-remembered conversations with guests who had left the hotel feeling unseen. He paused at a name, Avery Monroe, highlighted in yellow. The ink faded, but persistent. A memory surfaced. Her portrait in the hotel lobby, the only black face among a sea of founders. Julian's jaw tightened. He scrawled a question in the margin. Who decides who belongs? The answer, he knew, was buried in the patterns the hotel tried to hide. A junior reporter leaned over the partition, voice low. Are you still in that hotel story? Julian nodded, not looking up. There's something there. I can feel it. The junior reporter shrugged, sympathy flickering in his eyes. Careful, they don't like it when you dig too deep. Julian offered a tight smile, already turning back to his notes. He flipped to a fresh page, writing Avery's name in bold at the top. The newsroom's fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across his desk. Julian's determination only hardened. The truth was hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the dots. He circled the name again, the pen scratch loud in the quiet. This story wouldn't be buried. Not this time. Child Avery pressed her face to the hotel's lobby window, mesmerized by the towering Christmas tree inside. Golden ornaments shimmered, and the whole room glowed with a warmth she longed to feel. She tugged her mother's hand, eyes wide with wonder, but as they stepped through the revolving door, the atmosphere shifted. A security guard near the entrance straightened, his gaze locking onto Avery and her mother. He rested both hands on his belt, posture stiffening, and followed their every move with a look that warned they were out of place. Avery's excitement faltered. She glanced up at her mother, searching for reassurance, but found only a gentle, sad smile. As they moved closer to the tree, the guard's footsteps echoed behind them, heavy and deliberate. Other guests glanced over, their conversations pausing. as Avery and her mother passed. The joy she'd felt moments before faded, replaced by a knot in her stomach. Her mother bent down, voice soft but urgent. "We don't belong here, baby. Let's go." Avery's eyes filled with tears as she looked back at the sparkling lights, the magic of the moment slipping away. The guard's face, stern and unmoving, stayed with her as they exited, his presence a silent reminder that some spaces were not meant for them. Years later, Avery would walk through lobbies just like that one, her posture tall and her gaze steady, but the memory of that night lingered. She could still feel the sting of being watched, the ache of being made invisible in a place meant for celebration. The tree's lights blurred in her memory, not from distance, but from the tears she had tried to hide. The lesson was clear and lasting. Awe could be crushed by a single look, and belonging was never guaranteed. Avery sat in the dim glow of her office, the only light coming from the laptop screen as she watched security footage on repeat. The images were grainy but clear enough. A black couple, dressed for a night out, approached the front desk with hopeful smiles. Stephen intercepted them, his body language formal, but his eyes cold. He shook his head, gestured toward the door, and after a brief, tense exchange, the couple's expressions fell. Their shoulders drooped as they turned away, the moment of rejection captured in a few silent seconds. Avery clicked through more files, each labeled by date and time. The pattern emerged always the same: black guests arriving, being met with polite but firm refusal, and then leaving, disappointment etched on their faces. Her jaw tightened as she opened a folder marked VIP Exceptions. Inside were photos and notes about preferred white guests, their arrivals greeted with handshakes, smiles, and upgrades. The contrast was glaring, the message impossible to deny. Avery's hand trembled as she paused the footage on Stephen's face, caught in a fleeting moment of satisfaction as another guest walked away. Maya entered quietly, placing a stack of printed emails on the desk. "It's not just 1 or 2 nights," she said softly. "This has been happening for years." Avery nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I see it now." The walls around them felt closer, the air heavier with the weight of what had been hidden in plain sight. She scrolled through online reviews, each one echoing the same story. "Turned away, despite a reservation." "Treated like I didn't belong." The evidence was overwhelming, the silence that had protected the system finally breaking. Avery's resolve hardened. She opened a new document, her fingers steady now, ready to turn quiet accusations into public action. The footage kept looping, a silent chorus of injustice demanding to be heard. A new review appeared online late at night, its words plain but devastating. "Treated like a criminal for existing. Reservation confirmed, but I was told there was no room. I watched others check in after me. I left in tears." The post spread quickly, screenshots shared across social media, each retweet a ripple through the city's quiet. In the hotel's break room, staff clustered around their phones, scrolling through the comments. Some nodded in grim recognition, while others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. The night manager frowned, muttering about troublemakers, but his voice was shaky, the usual certainty gone. Stephen read the review on his office computer, jaw clenched. He fired off an email to have it removed, but by then, the story had already escaped his control. The concierge, passing by the open door, caught a glimpse of the screen and hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. Down the hall, Maya watched the numbers climb, the reviews, likes, multiplying, the comment section filling with stories that echoed the same pain. "Me too. Happened to my family last year. They said the system lost my booking." Avery sat in her office reading each comment, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and vindication. The review was more than a complaint. It was a spark, igniting voices that had been quiet for too long. The hotel's polished image began to crack, the truth leaking through every new reply. In the lobby, a housekeeper wiped down the counter, pausing to glance at the growing crowd outside, news vans, activists, and guests who no longer wanted to be silent. The review remained at the top of the page, impossible to ignore. It was the first domino, and as it fell, the weight of every hidden story began to press down on the hotel's foundation. The silence was broken, and nothing would be the same. Maya sat at her kitchen table, the glow of her laptop illuminating stacks of files and a mug gone cold. She hesitated, cursor hovering over the attach button, heart pounding in her chest. The documents told the story in numbers and names: denied reservations, guest complaints, internal memos with Stephen's signature, and photos of him shaking hands with select VIPs. She glanced at her phone, a message from Avery unread. "Are you awake?" Maya took a breath, attached the files, and typed out a brief anonymous note. "You need to see this." Her finger hovered over send, the weight of what she was about to do settling on her shoulders. Downstairs, a janitor mopped the lobby floor, humming softly, unaware of the storm brewing above. Maya's hand trembled as she finally clicked send. The screen flashed delivered, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She sat back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of a late-night bus outside. The city was quiet, but Maya knew that would change by morning. At the hotel, Stephen slept soundly, oblivious to the email now waiting in multiple inboxes: journalists, board members, and a few trusted staff. Maya closed her laptop, exhaustion settling in. She knew there was no turning back. The hotel's secrets were out, and the truth would move faster than any denial or cover-up. She poured herself another cup of coffee, hands steadier now, and watched the first hints of dawn creep through the blinds. The documents, once hidden in locked drawers and forgotten folders, were now a fuse lit in the dark. Maya pressed her palms to her face, relief and fear mingling. She whispered, "It's done." Upstairs, the inboxes pinged to life, and the first dominoes began to fall. The city woke to a storm of notifications. A single tweet, "Own your worth." Tress Leatherstay, shot across timelines, accompanied by a screenshot of the anonymous review and a photo of Avery's portrait in the hotel lobby. Within hours, the hashtag trended. Teenagers posed for selfies outside the hotel, arms folded, faces determined. Local activists retweeted the stories, adding their own, "This happened to my aunt." "My brother was turned away last summer." The comment threads grew, a digital chorus rising with every refresh. White influencers caught off guard posted statements, "I had no idea." Black women replied, "We always knew." The divide was laid bare in real time. The hotel's reputation unraveling with each new voice. News vans parked outside, reporters setting up in the early light. Inside, Stephen's phone buzzed relentlessly, messages piling up, furious guests, worried board members and journalists demanding comment. Staff gathered in the break room, eyes glued to their screens. The concierge scrolled through the hashtag, his hands trembling. "It's everywhere," he whispered to a colleague, who nodded, lips pressed tight. Maya watched it all unfold from her apartment, exhaustion and relief mingling as she saw the truth take hold. Avery, standing in her office, stared at her phone, watching the numbers climb. She felt the weight of every story, every voice, every shared memory of exclusion and pain. The hotel's polished exterior was now just a backdrop for protest signs and camera crews. The hashtag pulsed on every device, a rallying cry that could not be silenced. In the lobby, a housekeeper paused mid-step, listening to the distant sound of chanting from the street. The city had woken up, and the storm was only just beginning. The hotel's back corridors buzzed with quiet tension. A housekeeper slipped a folded note under Avery's door, the words simple but powerful. "We see you." The concierge, usually brisk and detached, lingered a moment longer at the front desk, his eyes flickering with a mix of guilt and hope. A bellhop, pushing a cart laden with luggage, exchanged a brief, knowing glance with a colleague before offering a small, supportive smile. Stephen paced the manager's office, the weight of the growing unrest pressing on his shoulders. He stopped, by the window, watching staff move through the lobby with a new, cautious confidence. His attempts to maintain control felt increasingly futile, the old rhythms disrupted by whispered alliances and subtle acts of defiance. In the break room, a group of employees huddled around a phone, scrolling through the "Ichwo's Let Her Stay" hashtag. Their faces were a mix of determination and fear, the digital uprising fueling their courage. A young receptionist glanced nervously toward the door, then back at the screen, her fingers trembling as she typed a message of support. The lobby's usual hum was replaced by a charged stillness. Every glance and gesture weighted with unspoken meaning. A housekeeper straightened a vase of flowers with deliberate care, her hands steady despite the storm gathering beneath the surface. The concierge's voice, when it came, was low and measured, a quiet call to solidarity. Stephen's voice echoed through the halls, but it was met with silence or polite nods. The staff's loyalty was shifting, their unity growing in the shadows. The chandelier above flickered, casting fractured light across the marble floor, mirroring the fractures forming within the hotel's walls. Avery stood at the center of it all, a calm presence amid the brewing storm. Her eyes met those of the staff, a silent promise passing between them. The hotel was no longer just a building. It was a battleground for dignity, respect, and change. The quiet rebellion was not loud, but it was unstoppable, carried in sideways, glances, whispered words, and the steady rhythm of footsteps marching toward justice. Emails poured into the board's inbox, subject lines urgent and raw. Turned away in 2017. My daughter cried all night. They said my card was declined, but it wasn't. Each message carried a story, some brief and clipped, others spilling paragraphs of pain and disbelief. The board's secretary printed them out, hands trembling as the stack grew taller by the hour. She paused at one message, a mother's account of her son's birthday ruined by a denied reservation, and blinked back tears before adding it to the pile. In her office, Avery read each testimony, the words settling on her shoulders like stones. Some emails were anonymous, the senders afraid of backlash, but their voices rang clear, patterns of exclusion, humiliation, and the same names appearing again and again. She highlighted key passages, marking the dates and details, building a case that could not be dismissed. Stephen's office, once a place of authority, now felt smaller with every new story. He watched the secretary carry the growing stack past. His door, her face set and determined. He tried to focus on his own screen, but the ping of new messages was relentless, each one a reminder that his control was slipping away. In the staff lounge, employees whispered about the flood of testimonies. A bellhop read aloud from a printed email, his voice shaking. The housekeeper who had left the note under Avery's door nodded in grim agreement. The stories were no longer isolated complaints. Together they became a collective roar, impossible to ignore. Avery gathered the printed pages, her resolve sharpening with every line. The truth was out, and the system that had protected itself for so long was finally exposed. The boardroom would not be able to look away. The weight of so many voices pressed forward, demanding to be heard, and change was no longer a distant hope. It was at the door. The boardroom was thick with tension, every tick of the wall clock slicing through the hush. Avery stood at the head of the table, her posture unwavering, a stack of documents in front of her, each page a story, a wound, a demand for change. Board members filed in, some avoiding her gaze, others nodding in silent respect. Stephen sat at the far end, tie askew, eyes darting between the agenda and the window where the city's skyline glowed. Outside, a crowd gathered, their signs pressed to the glass, their faces expectant and resolute. The hotel's doors, once a symbol of exclusion, now stood open, the world watching for what would come next. Avery slid the final document onto the agenda. Termination for cause. The chairwoman's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands folded tightly. One board member cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We can't ignore this any longer. Another nodded, voice low. The evidence is overwhelming. The room shifted, power moving quietly away from Stephen, whose fingers drummed a frantic rhythm on the polished table. He rehearsed excuses under his breath, but the words felt hollow now, stripped of authority. The clock's hands inched forward, each second a drumbeat of inevitability. Avery's eyes met Stephen's, calm and steady, her resolve unshaken. The chandelier above cast fractured light, throwing restless shadows across the faces of those assembled. A junior board member glanced at her phone, watching the live feed. Of protesters outside, the hashtag #LeatherStay scrolling endlessly. The pressure was everywhere, in the crowded street, in the inboxes overflowing with testimonies, in the hearts of those finally ready to act. As the meeting was called to order, Avery's voice was clear, every word deliberate. We owe it to every guest who was ever turned away. We owe it to ourselves. The boardroom, once a fortress, now felt like a crossroads. The clock struck the hour. The door opened, and the world held its breath. Avery entered the boardroom with a quiet confidence, her posture straight and unyielding. The polished table reflected her determined gaze as she took her seat. The room's tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Stephen adjusted his tie nervously, beads of sweat forming at his collar. His hands trembled slightly, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on the armrest. The cameras, their red lights blinking steadily, captured every subtle flinch and twitch, broadcasting the moment live to a city holding its breath. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, some avoiding Avery's steady eyes, others stealing quick looks at Stephen's faltering composure. The legal counsel shuffled papers, the rustle loud in the heavy silence. A reporter's pen hovered over a notepad, poised to capture every word, every pause. Stephen's jaw tightened as he tried to summon the practiced calm that had served him for years. His voice, when it came, was clipped and uncertain. Avery's presence was a silent challenge, her calm a stark contrast to his unraveling facade. The room seemed to shrink around him, the weight of evidence and public scrutiny pressing down. Outside, the hum of the city was replaced by the low murmur of a crowd gathered in anticipation. The live stream's red light was a beacon, a spotlight on a reckoning long overdue. Every eye in the room was fixed on the unfolding drama, the unspoken promise that the truth would no longer be hidden. Avery's gaze swept the room, her voice steady but soft when she finally spoke. "You denied me a room in my own hotel," she said, the words carrying the weight of years of exclusion. Stephen's face paled, his confidence crumbling like fragile glass. The cameras caught the moment, the silent collapse of a man who had underestimated the power of quiet dignity. The boardroom held its breath, waiting for the world to crack open and justice to pour through the fissures. The live stream continued, the red light blinking steadily, a pulse marking the beginning of change. Avery reached into her briefcase, the quiet click of the latch echoing in the tense boardroom. She pulled out a thick folder, its edges worn from countless readings, and placed it squarely in the center of the table. The sound was sharp, final like a judge's gavel. Every eye in the room fixed on the folder as she slid it toward the chairwoman, her movements steady and deliberate. Stephen's breath caught. His fingers curled into fists beneath the table. The chairwoman opened the folder, revealing a cascade of evidence. Denied reservations, internal emails, guest complaints, and photographs of Stephen shaking hands with favored guests. Each page was a strike against the old order, the weight of years of exclusion exposed in black and white. Board members leaned in, their faces paling as they read. One cleared his throat, voice barely above a whisper. "This is extensive," Stephen tried to interject, his voice cracking. "These are isolated incidents, misunderstandings." But his words faltered as Avery met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "It's a pattern," she replied, her tone calm but unyielding. "A pattern you chose not to see." A junior board member flipped through the documents, her hands shaking. The legal counsel scribbled notes, his pen scratching furiously across the page. The weight of the evidence pressed down on the room, suffocating any attempt at denial. The livestream camera zoomed in on the folder, the world watching as the truth was laid bare. Stephen's throat bobbed as he recognized his own handwriting on several damning memos. The air thickened, the silence punctuated only by the turning of pages and the distant sound of protesters outside. Avery's final gesture was simple but devastating. She closed the folder and looked around the table, her voice clear. "This is not just paperwork. These are people's lives." The message landed with the force of a verdict. The boardroom, once a sanctuary for power, now felt like a courtroom, awaiting judgment. The boardroom felt colder as Avery gestured toward the wall of portraits. The founders' faces, rendered in oil and gilt frames, stared down with the weight of a century's pride and denial. Among them, Avery's own portrait was newer, her gaze direct and unyielding, a symbol of change, but also of how little had shifted beneath the surface. Board members shifted in their seats, some glancing up at the portraits only to look away quickly, as if the painted eyes could see through their discomfort. The chairwoman's hands folded tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. Stephen sat rigid, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the table. He refused to look at Avery or her portrait, but his jaw worked, tension visible in the muscle beneath his skin. Avery's voice was steady. "These faces are the story this hotel has chosen to tell, but for years that story left out too many." Her words hung in the air, unanswered. One board member coughed, the sound sharp in the silence. Another scribbled something in his notebook, pen shaking slightly. The legal counsel cleared his throat, but said nothing, his gaze fixed on his hands. The chandelier's light fractured across the polished table, casting shifting patterns on the floor. Outside, the crowd's chants rose and fell, muffled but insistent. The portraits seemed to bear witness, their painted eyes following every movement, every word, every pause. Stephen's hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if bracing for a blow. The tension in the room was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Avery looked up at her own portrait, then back at the board. "We can't change the past, but we can decide what kind of story we tell from here." The silence was absolute, the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. In that moment, the old order trembled, and the first cracks appeared in the wall of tradition. The room was dimly lit, the glow of a large screen casting blue light on the faces of the board members. Tweets flooded the feed, each one a story, a voice rising in unison under the hashtag, "Let Her Stay." The camera zoomed in on the scrolling. Messages, mothers sharing heartbreak, teens posting defiant selfies, activists calling for justice. Phones buzzed relentlessly, notifications piling up like a storm. Stephen's face paled as he watched the digital tide swell, the hotel's logo flashing mockingly beside the hashtag. His fingers trembled over the keyboard, unable to stem the flood. A board member's phone vibrated, the screen lighting up with the trending topic. She glanced around, eyes wide, the weight of public judgment settling in the room. Outside, the Ual city pulsed with energy. Protesters gathered, their chants a steady drumbeat against the hotel's polished facade. News vans lined the street, reporters setting up cameras, the hashtag echoing through every broadcast. Inside, staff huddled in small groups, sharing stories and watching the movement grow. Maya sat quietly in her apartment, watching the numbers climb, exhaustion and hope mingling in her eyes. Avery's phone buzzed with messages of support and solidarity, the city's heartbeat syncing with the call for change. The lobby, once a place of cold formality, now felt alive with possibility. The screen's glow reflected in Avery's eyes as she stood firm, the weight of every shared story pressing on her shoulders. The hashtag was more than a trend, it was a reckoning, a collective voice that could no longer be ignored. The hotel's polished image cracked, revealing the fractures beneath. The room held its breath, the digital storm raging on, unstoppable and fierce. The balance of power was shifting, and the world was watching. The room fell into a heavy silence as the chairwoman called for the vote. Hands rose, some hesitantly, others with newfound certainty, until every member's voice joined in a steady chorus. "Aye." The word echoed, bouncing off the polished walls and settling into the wood, a declaration that could not be taken back. Stephen's head dropped, the badge that once gleamed with authority slipping from his hand and landing on the table with a dull clatter. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, now sagged under the weight of accountability. He stared at the badge for a long moment, as if seeing it for the first time, then let his hand fall away. Avery remained composed, her expression unreadable. This was not a moment of triumph, but of reckoning. The air shifted, the tension that had held the room hostage for so long finally breaking. The chandelier above scattered fractured light across the boardroom, casting shadows that danced along the walls and seemed to stretch toward the open door. A junior board member let out a shaky breath, relief and resolve mingling in her eyes. Others exchanged glances, some with regret, some with hope, all changed by what had just transpired. Outside, the crowd's murmur grew, word of the decision rippling through the city. The hotel's doors, once symbols of exclusion, now seemed to stand open, inviting in a new era. The vote was more than a formality. It was a line drawn in the sand, a signal that the system would no longer protect those who abused their power. Stephen rose, gathering his things with slow, deliberate movements. The sound of his heels on the floor was hollow, final. Avery watched him go, her gaze steady, her resolve unshaken. The boardroom, once a fortress, had become a place of change. Stephen stood, the weight of the board's decision settling on his shoulders as he gathered his belongings in silence. His badge, once polished and proudly displayed, now lay abandoned on the table, its gold dulled under the harsh boardroom lights. He hesitated, hand hovering over it, but left it behind, a relic of authority that no longer belonged to him. The chair he'd occupied for years sat empty, its leather creased and worn, a testament to the power he once wielded and the isolation he now faced. As Stephen walked toward the door, each step echoed through the quiet, the sound of his heels, sharp and final. No one spoke. The board members watched, some with relief, others with somber reflection, as the man who had shaped so much of the hotel's culture exited without a word. The junior board member who had voted first for his removal glanced down at her notes, hands trembling with the enormity of what had just transpired. The chairwoman's gaze remained steady, her lips pressed into a thin line, signaling both the end of an era and the beginning of something new. Avery's eyes followed Stephen's retreat, her face calm but resolute. She noticed the badge glinting on the table, a symbol now stripped of meaning. The room felt lighter, the oppressive tension that had filled it for so long finally lifting. Outside, the sound of distant applause filtered in through the glass, the city acknowledging the shift even before the boardroom's doors closed. Stephen paused at the threshold, casting one last look back at the room, but no one met his eyes. He stepped into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind him, a hollow sound that marked the closing of a chapter. The badge remained where it was, untouched, a silent witness to the cost of lost integrity and the promise of change. Workmen moved quietly in the lobby, careful not to disturb the gathering crowd as they mounted a new brass plaque beside the Wall of Founders. The plaque caught the afternoon light, its inscription simple but powerful, for those denied. Avery stood nearby, hands folded, watching as the final screws were tightened. Her portrait, once set apart among the founders, now had a companion, a public acknowledgment of the pain and perseverance woven into the hotel's history. A woman in the crowd approached, her fingertips tracing the engraved words. She whispered, "My grandmother was turned away here." Her voice trembled, but her stance was proud. Avery met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. The moment was heavy with memory but also with hope. Marcus, the retired bellhop, stood off to the side, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. For years he had walked these halls unseen, his service unrecognized. Now his story, and so many others, were carved into the very walls that had once excluded them. Maya snapped a photo, capturing the plaque, the portraits, and the faces of those gathered, a new chapter preserved for all to see. Staff members paused in their duties, some touching the plaque as they passed, others simply nodding in respect. The lobby, once a place of quiet exclusion, now felt transformed, the air lighter, the shadows of the past acknowledged but no longer in control. Avery placed her hand on the plaque, her touch gentle but firm. She spoke softly. "This isn't just for me. It's for everyone who was ever told no." The words settled into the space, a promise that the hotel would remember and that it would do better. The camera lingered on the plaque, the gold, letters gleaming beneath the lobby lights. Outside, the crowd watched through the glass, witnessing the moment history was rewritten, not by erasing the past, but by honoring those who endured it. Stephen sat alone in his dim apartment, the glow of his laptop the only light in the room. The screen displayed a draft email, cursor blinking after the unfinished words. "Ms. Monroe, He stared at the sentence, hands hovering over the keyboard, but the right words refused to come. Regret pressed in from all sides. Memories. Looping through his mind, Avery's calm voice in the boardroom, the board's decision, the applause outside the hotel. He tried again, typing, "I'm sorry for," but stopped, unable to finish. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of city traffic. He scrolled back to old messages from his mentor, the ones he'd ignored, and to the news alerts now crowding his inbox. Each headline was a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd refused to see. The apology on the screen felt empty, too late to matter. His finger hovered over the send button, then moved to delete. The draft vanished, the screen going dark as he closed the laptop with a soft click. Outside his window, the hotel's lights sparkled against the night, the new plaque gleaming in the lobby. Stephen's reflection in the glass looked older, smaller, a man left behind by the change he'd tried to resist. He pressed his forehead to the cool pain, eyes closed, listening to the city's pulse as it moved on without him. In that quiet, he understood what he could never undo. The apology would remain unsent, frozen in the memory of a night when the world changed, and he was left on the outside, watching. The hotel's legacy was no longer his to shape. The story had moved forward, and he was just a shadow in its wake. A young black family steps into the hotel lobby, their faces bright with wonder and cautious hope. The little girl skips ahead, her eyes wide as she takes in the sparkling chandelier and the polished marble floors that once seemed so distant and unwelcoming. Her parents exchange a glance, relief softening the lines of worry that had shadowed their journey. The receptionist greets them warmly, handing over a keycard with a genuine smile, a simple act that carries the weight of countless battles won. The father bends down to the girl's level, whispering encouragement as she twirls in delight. Staff, members pass by, their expressions open and kind, a stark contrast to the cold indifference that once defined this space. The new manager, a poised black woman, watches from the desk, her eyes reflecting pride and quiet triumph. Unaware of the storm their arrival has helped calm, the family moves through the lobby with a sense of belonging that was once denied to so many. The camera lingers on Avery's portrait, now softened by the light, a silent guardian of change and hope. The marble floors, once cold and unyielding, now echo with laughter and the promise of a future where everyone is welcome. The scene closes, with the girl's laughter blending into the hum of the hotel, a melody of healing and new beginnings. The hotel, reborn through resilience and quiet justice, stands as a beacon of transformation in a city still learning to embrace its own reflection.